Hey guys, and welcome to episode 2 of Booked with the Cook. So this morning I'm wearing my new summer reading t-shirt. This summer's theme is Imagine Your Story and is emphasizing the fantasy genre. This is unabashedly my favorite genre of all time, and this week starts a set of videos inspired by one of my favorite book series in that genre, The Lord of the Rings. This week's recipe is specifically inspired by the tea at the beginning of the first book of the series, The Hobbit, in which the titular hobbit's house is crashed by a bunch of unruly dwarves and a wizard. No tea, no matter how unruly, would be complete without scones. If you guys have come to a tea party event at the Winter Park Library in the past few years, these would have been the scones that you most likely would have eaten. So now you can have your own Hobbit-inspired tea party right at home. Now, as far as the recipe I'm using, well, alright then, magic. I'll be using the flaky scones recipe from The Bread Bible by Rose Brennenbaum. This is hands down one of my favorite cookbooks of all time, and I'll not only be adding it to the library's collection very soon, but I'll also leave an Amazon link in the description below so you can get your own copy of this awesome book. Okay, let me think, is there anything else I'll need? I wonder if this will work. Oh yes, I am going to have fun with this. So both of these items are optional. This is called a pastry cutter, though it looks like what would happen if Wolverine was just totally useless. I'll show you how to use this handy dandy little guy later. But this thing is a food scale. Now if you don't have one of these things, you need one. You can use cup measures for this recipe, but I found that weighing out the ingredients gives me a much nicer result. So for this recipe, you'll need 4 1/4 cups or 608 grams of all-purpose flour, 1/2 cup or 100 grams of sugar, 1/4 teaspoon of salt, 2 liquid cups or 464 grams of heavy cream, 1 cup or 227 grams of unsalted butter, and finally you'll need both baking powder and baking soda, of which you'll need either 2 teaspoons and 1/2 teaspoon or 9.6 and 2.5 grams respectively. Now I'll show you how to use a food scale to measure out the ingredients like I do with this recipe. You'll notice that when I first put down a bowl I'm going to use on the scale, it has a weight, which might be a problem if I need a precise amount of an ingredient in grams, since recipes that use the metric system don't take into account the weight of the vessel holding the ingredient. So you're going to use this button. The 0 button just takes the weight that's already on the scale and dials it back to 0. Essentially, it's just ignoring whatever you've already put on it. This allows you to put a vessel, like a bowl, on the scale, 0 it out, and then add your ingredient to the bowl for a precise measurement. If you're using a vessel that's large enough, you can actually 0 it out after each ingredient if your recipe allows, saving you time in dishes. I'm just going to weigh out my sugar here to demonstrate what I mean. You'll notice I'm not really using anything special to scoop out my ingredients. Any spoon, cup, or scoop will do. Just keep ladling it in until you get the amount that you need. If you go over, don't worry about it. Just scoop a little bit back out and put it back in its original container. Now what is really cool is that because I'm working in grams, you can actually measure liquid the exact same way that you would do with solid ingredients like sugar or flour. Word to the wise though, if you're working with a liquid, be sure to use a container with a spout. That way if you get a bit too much, you can again always pour it back into your original container. Finally, I would recommend putting your butter, pre-measured and ready to go, in the freezer for about 15 to 20 minutes. You want this stuff to be as cold as possible, and you'll find out why when we start putting these guys together. On the complete opposite end of the heat spectrum, you'll need to preheat your oven to 400 degrees Fahrenheit. Get out a baking sheet and put that thing right in the oven while it's preheating. We want this thing as hot as the fires of Mordor so we get a nice brown bottom on these scones. Now that our adventuring party is assembled, time to start the mixing leg of the journey. Wait a minute here, I'm missing something. Let's try it again. Wait for it. Ah, yes! I am never hunting for utensils again! Now we're going to whisk the dry ingredients. It doesn't really matter which ones you start with. By the way, you might have noticed I only have 3 bowls of dry ingredients here. I blended my salt, baking powder, and baking soda together since all these ingredients were getting thrown in here anyway. Once those are good and incorporated, it's time to mix in our butter. This stuff here is pretty close to frozen, so just use your spatula to get any stubborn bits into your mixture. Now it's time to break out your pastry cutter. If you don't have one of these at home, you can use your fingers to do pretty much the same thing by pressing the butter into the flour. The reason I like to use a pastry cutter instead is because the radiant heat from your fingers can cause the butter to start melting, which is the opposite of what we want in this case. Be prepared for a workout though. This stuff is tough to cut through, and I sped this up by about 500% because this took me nearly 10 minutes to get the butter fully incorporated into the flour mixture. And when I say fully incorporated, it's not going to be blended like a cookie dough or a cake batter. The butter will really just be in small chunks. Most recipes use the phrase the size of small walnuts to describe the ideal size of these chunks of butter, but I'd recommend them to be just a bit smaller, maybe a size between a small walnut and a really fat peanut. Time to add our one liquid ingredient, the heavy cream. There's nothing special to this step either, just go ahead and pour it in. Stir the mixture with your spatula until everything is holding together in a very shaggy dough. The goal here is to mix lightly but to not knead. Pretty much the opposite of the last video. You don't want gluten to start forming, which will give you a really thick and bready texture instead of the light and flaky biscuit-like texture we're going for. Speaking of biscuits, that's basically what the modern scone really is, a sweetened biscuit, if you're an American like me. However, if you're British, a biscuit is what we would call a cookie here in the United States. American-style biscuits are very similar to scones in construction and texture. In fact, if you took this very recipe, didn't put any sugar in it, put a touch more salt, and replaced the heavy cream with buttermilk, an American-style buttermilk biscuit is exactly what you would get. Now, when I said shaggy dough, I mean it will be just barely able to hold together. Once it's formed somewhat of a cohesive mass, liberally flour your work surface and turn your dough out onto it. At this stage, we just want to continue coaxing this mixture together, but again, don't knead it. Really, you're just going to want to sort of squish everything together. Pretend like it's a pile of Play-Doh that you actually can eat. Oh yeah, Return of the King. Pin. Rolling pin, that is. Flour said rolling pin and go ahead on starting to roll out your dough. We want it to be just over 1/4 of an inch thick. Once you've gotten it to the thickness that you need, fold it over in thirds, kind of like a letter. Turn your dough 90 degrees and roll it out again to the same thickness as before along the seam that you created with your doughy envelope. Keep doing this 3 or 4 more times to give yourself a bunch of lovely layers. This process is called lamination. It's just taking dough and blending butter into it by layering the butter and dough back onto themselves. It's actually the same process that gives croissant their layers as well. If your dough starts sticking to either your pen or your work surface, just fold it over and pop it in the freezer for a few minutes to get it to firm up again. Let me show you what it looks like on my end so you can get a better understanding of what I'm doing. As you can see, I'm rolling out my dough. Here's the seam where I folded the dough over, and you're going to want to see that seam totally disappear. If you look closely, you'll see the little pieces of yellow butter peeking out from just underneath the surface of the dough. Once we finish that last turn, it's time to cut out our scones. This recipe originally called for the scones to be cut into triangles, but my family likes for them to be round, so I'm using my biscuit cutter for this part. Generously flour your cutter and press it down firmly into your dough. Try your best to be as vertical as possible when doing this because we want the side to be clean and flaky, and cutting it at an angle will pinch in those sides, preventing our scones from rising. Once you've finished cutting out all your scones, just wad your dough back up, throw some cling wrap around it, and pop it in the freezer to roll out and cut later. Pro tip, the colder your scones are when you put them in the oven, the better they will rise. Speaking of ovens, it's time to put ours to work. Get out your now hot baking sheet and try to put a piece of parchment paper down on it without scalding the snot out of your hands. Quickly place your scones on the sheet and pop it in the oven for between 20 to 25 minutes. I would say until golden brown, but these things stay pretty pale without a bit of tanning assistance. For a glossy golden top, you can actually brush on a bit of melted butter for a more golden tone. Once they're done, get out a wire rack and place a tea towel on it. Then, put your scones on the tea towel and cover them so the scones won't dry out while cooling. And there you have it, scones perfect for tea, dessert, second breakfast, anytime really. Thanks for joining us today, guys. Join us next week for some lovely seed cake. Leave us a thumbs up if you like this video and your questions and suggestions for future episodes in the comment section down below. Alright, take care everyone. I'll see you later.